Most people think they know the nightmare of the USS Indianapolis. They picture a ship struck by torpedoes, its crew abandoned to the sharks. That is only one level of disaster. In reality, the story plunges through 7 layers, starting with a record-breaking secret mission to deliver the atomic bomb, and continuing with classified orders that left 1,197 men alone in hostile waters. Each hidden decision set up the next horror. How does a mission that promised triumph become a blueprint for betrayal and tragedy? The descent begins with the first layer where pride blinds the crew to the trap waiting beneath the surface. The USS Indianapolis was more than just another ship in the Pacific. She was the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, a heavy cruiser with 10 battle stars to her name and a reputation for speed and reliability. Her decks had seen the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and her guns had thundered in some of the fiercest battles of the war. But in July 1945, she received a mission unlike any before. Early on the morning of July 16, 1945, while the world's first atomic bomb detonated in the New Mexico desert, Captain Charles B. McVay III took command of a top-secret cargo. Locked away in guarded crates were uranium-235 and components for the weapon that would soon flatten Hiroshima. The orders were clear: deliver the atomic bomb's heart to Tinian Island as fast as possible. McVay pushed his ship and crew to the limit. Deck logs show the Indianapolis left San Francisco at 6:30 in the morning, racing across the Pacific at speeds that shattered previous records. In just 74.5 hours, she reached Pearl Harbor, faster than any other ship of her class. The crew sensed the urgency, but knew nothing of the cargo's true nature. Even the officers could only guess. Every stop was brief, every procedure tight. No one lingered. By July 26th, the Indianapolis had reached Tinian, completing the delivery in 10 days flat, an achievement that would have made headlines if anyone had known. On board, the mood was proud and electric. The ship was running at her best, the men sharp and confident. Captain McVay, already respected for his calm under fire, seemed to have brought his ship through the war's deadliest waters with skill and nerve. To the men of the Indianapolis, this was the height of their service, the kind of mission sailors remember for a lifetime. But beneath the surface, hidden by layers of secrecy, decisions were being made that would soon turn triumph into tragedy. The orders handed down to the USS Indianapolis after her secret mission were shaped by layers of institutional caution and compartmentalized intelligence. Once the bomb's components had been delivered to Tinian, the ship was instructed to sail from Guam to Leyte alone. This was no minor detail. In the final months of the war, Navy protocol called for capital ships to travel with a destroyer escort through waters where Japanese submarines still hunted. But the Indianapolis was given no such protection. The reason was secret. The cargo she had carried was so highly classified that even her movement orders were treated as sensitive. The logic was simple: fewer ships, fewer eyes, less chance of a leak. But this logic left the Indianapolis exposed, a lone target in a vast ocean. Behind closed doors in Pearl Harbor and Guam, another decision was made, one that would prove even more dangerous. Intelligence officers had intercepted Japanese communications showing that submarines, including Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, commanding 158, were patrolling the very route assigned to the Indianapolis. This information, drawn from ultra code breaking, was locked behind the highest security clearances. The chain of command from FRUPAC at Pearl Harbor to the theater intelligence chiefs followed strict rules. Do not share ultra-derived warnings with ship commanders unless authorized at the highest level. In July 1945, authorization never came. No warning was passed to Captain McVay or the officers at Guam who plotted the Indianapolis's course. The men on board had no idea they were heading straight into the crosshairs of a Japanese submarine. The final hazard was buried in paperwork. The Navy's reporting system was designed for secrecy as well as safety. Arrival reports for combat ships were suspended to avoid tipping off enemy spies, but the regulations were vague on what to do if a ship simply vanished. No single officer or office was assigned to flag a missing arrival. When the Indianapolis failed to reach Leyte on schedule, the silence was not broken by alarm bells or urgent radio calls. It was met with nothing at all. The ship, her crew, and her fate slipped into a gap between protocols, a blind spot created by the very systems meant to protect them. In this environment, disaster was not just possible, it was inevitable. At 00:15 hours on July 30th, 1945, in the darkness, two Type 95 torpedoes raced from the tubes of the Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Mochitsura Hashimoto. The first slammed into the bow of the USS Indianapolis, tearing it open and sending a shockwave through the steel hull. Seconds later, the second torpedo struck amidships, just aft of the bridge, close to the powder magazine and fuel tanks. The explosion ripped through the belly of the ship, splitting the keel and igniting stores of oil and aviation fuel. Flames shot skyward. Bulkheads buckled. Men were thrown from their bunks, stumbling through corridors that filled instantly with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. Within moments, the Indianapolis began to list hard to starboard. Water flooded the lower decks, trapping hundreds below. Above, chaos erupted. Lifeboat davits jammed, cables snapped, and only a handful of rafts made it over the side. Some men leapt into burning oil slicks, others clung to debris as the ship's stern lifted out of the water. In 12 minutes, the pride of the Fifth Fleet rolled, broke apart, and disappeared beneath the Pacific. 300 men, nearly a quarter of the crew, were lost with the ship. 900 more were hurled into the open sea, scattered in the darkness, choking on oil and salt water, their ship gone without a trace. The silence that followed was broken only by the shouts of the living and the hiss of the settling wreck as the men of the Indianapolis began their fight to survive, not against an enemy they could see, but against the vast, empty ocean. Sunrise brought no comfort to the men of the Indianapolis. The Pacific stretched in every direction, empty and blinding. By midday, the temperature soared to 110 degrees. Life vests soaked up the sun, turning into ovens against bare skin. Oil from the wreck clung to faces and hands, burning eyes, coating tongues, and making every breath taste of gasoline. Most had no fresh water. Thirst clawed at their minds. Some tried to ration the tiny rain squalls that passed, catching drops in helmets or cupped hands, but most were left with only the sea. Desperation led men to drink salt water. The effect was swift and brutal. Seawater is 4 times saltier than blood. Within hours, kidneys failed, blood thickened, and the brain began to swell. Survivors later described men who, after drinking, lost all sense. They saw islands on the horizon that were not there. Others claimed the ship was just below the surface, waiting to be climbed back aboard. Some swam away, chasing hallucinations, never to return. Salt poisoning hypernatremia triggered more than confusion. It turned shipmates into threats. Delirious men lashed out, convinced their friends were enemies or that someone was hoarding water. Fights broke out over imagined supplies. One sailor remembered, men started screaming, attacking each other, eyes wild, raving, some biting, some trying to drown the ones next to them. The sun gave no mercy. By night, the water chilled already weakened bodies. Open wounds, soaked in salt and oil, festered. Infection set in. By the second day, men drifted in and out of consciousness, bodies racked with fever, minds lost to madness. The ocean became a floating asylum where the boundary between hope and horror dissolved with every passing hour. Long after thirst and madness had begun to claim the living, a new threat circled beneath the waves. The first dorsal fins appeared as the sun climbed higher, sleek, slow-moving, utterly indifferent to human suffering. These were oceanic white-tip sharks, Carcharinus longimanus, drawn by the scent of blood and oil drifting for miles across the current. Unlike the monsters of Hollywood legend, these sharks did not attack in frenzied packs. They moved with patience, picking off the isolated, the wounded, and the dead. Survivors formed desperate clusters, their only defense a tangle of arms and legs, kicking at shadows in the water. Men on the edges vanished without warning. Sometimes there was a scream, more often only a ripple and a spreading stain. The terror of the sharks was more psychological than physical. Each night, as darkness fell, the men listened for the sudden splash or muffled cry that meant another shipmate was gone. Shark watches became ritual, men taking turns to slap the water, hoping to keep the predators at bay. Some survivors later described the waiting as worse than the attacks themselves. The sense of being hunted, hour after hour, gnawed at whatever hope remained. Estimates vary, but most historians and marine biologists agree that between 50 and 150 men died directly from shark attacks. The majority succumbed to thirst, exposure, and wounds. The sharks, for all their menace, were acting on instinct. They were not the primary killers, but in the minds of the survivors, they became the face of the ocean's indifference. The real monster was not nature, but the silence that left nearly 1,000 men drifting defenseless for days on end. No distress call from the USS Indianapolis ever reached a Navy command post. The ship's radio room lost power almost instantly when the torpedoes hit, cutting off all hope of a formal SOS. In the hours and days that followed, shore stations across the Pacific remained silent. There are no radio logs, no message diaries, no evidence in Navy archives of any distress signal received or even suspected. Rumors would swirl for years, stories of ignored static or of operators who dismissed the call as a prank. But every official inquiry and every review of the communication logs came back with the same answer: nothing was heard. The real disaster played out not in the water, but in the paperwork. At Leyte, the port director's staff noticed that Indianapolis had not arrived, but the rules were vague. For security, the Navy had suspended arrival reports for combat ships. No one was specifically tasked to flag a missing cruiser. The officers on duty assumed that if no arrival report was required, neither was an overdue report. The ship simply vanished into a bureaucratic blind spot. No alarm was raised, no search was launched. 4 days passed. 900 men floated under the sun and stars, unseen and unmissed. The administrative silence was absolute. Only after a patrol plane stumbled on the oil slick did the Navy realize what had happened. By then, hundreds were already dead. The failure was not a single error, but an entire system built to keep secrets, even from itself. August 2nd, 1945. 4 days had passed since the Indianapolis slipped beneath the waves. The Pacific, flat and endless, gave no hint that hundreds of men were still alive, scattered and dying. Then, by pure chance, a PV-1 Ventura bomber piloted by Lieutenant Commander Wilbur Gwynn flew a routine anti-submarine patrol out of Peleliu. Near midday, as the plane swept low over the water, a crewman spotted a long, unnatural oil slick. Gwynn banked for a closer look and saw the impossible. Clusters of men were waving frantically, life vests stained with oil and blood. Gwynn broke radio silence and sent the first urgent message. Survivors were in the water, their position marked. The Navy scrambled what it could. Hours later, a PBY Catalina seaplane, call sign Dumbo, arrived on scene. Lieutenant Adrian Marks, seeing the desperate state below, made a decision that would be remembered for generations. Orders were clear. Do not land a seaplane in the open ocean, especially with 12-foot swells. Marks landed anyway. He taxied among the floating men, pulling as many as he could inside. The Catalina's fuselage quickly filled. With no more room, Marks and his crew tied survivors to the wings with parachute cord, knowing the extra weight might sink the plane. In all, Marks and his crew saved 56 men from the water before surface ships arrived. The PBY stayed afloat through the night, battered but seaworthy, a lifeline in a sea of loss. The rescue was not the result of a coordinated search, but a fluke, a patrol that happened to pass overhead, a pilot who refused to wait, and a crew who risked everything for strangers. In the end, it was human courage, not Navy procedure, that brought the first hope to the men of the Indianapolis. In late 1945, the Navy convened a court-martial against Captain Charles B. McVay III, an act unprecedented in American naval history. No other U.S. captain had ever been tried for losing his ship to enemy action during war. The charges were clear. McVay was accused of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. The maneuver meant to make torpedo attacks harder and left to a captain's discretion based on conditions. The prosecution leaned on that technicality, ignoring that zigzagging at night in calm seas could just as easily have exposed the ship to other dangers. The trial unfolded in Washington, D.C., with McVay facing a tribunal of senior officers. The Navy's case rested on the idea that a single decision made in darkness and uncertainty doomed the Indianapolis. To bolster their argument, the government did something unheard of. They brought in the enemy. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, captain of the Japanese submarine E-58, was flown from Japan to testify. The courtroom waited as Hashimoto, through an interpreter, was asked the central question: would zigzagging have saved the ship? His answer cut through months of blame. I would have sunk her anyway. Despite that testimony, the court found McVay guilty of hazarding his ship. The sentence was later remitted, but the stain remained. The Navy, seeking a scapegoat for systemic failures, placed the burden of tragedy on one man's shoulders. Captain Charles McVay returned to civilian life with a stain that would not wash away. The verdict from his court-martial lingered, shadowing every day. Letters from grieving families arrived for decades, some blaming him for the loss, others pleading for answers. By 1968, the burden had become unbearable. That year, McVay ended his life at home in Connecticut. He was found with his Navy-issued revolver and a small toy sailor in his hand, a silent witness to the weight he carried. For years, the official record stood unchanged. The Navy's silence was matched only by the public's fading memory. But injustice has a way of resurfacing. In 1997, an 11-year-old named Hunter Scott, inspired by a school project, began to collect survivor accounts and official documents. He found the truth that had been buried. McVay had been condemned for failures that were not his own. Scott's research reached Congress, and survivors rallied behind him. In October 2000, the congressional record finally cleared McVay's name. The apology came too late for the man himself, but not for his legacy. The story of the Indianapolis closed with vindication, not for the Navy, but for the captain who had carried his crew's fate alone for far too long. Every layer of this disaster exposes a truth. Systems built to protect can just as easily betray. Today, the Navy's official record still lists Captain McVay's conviction, even after his exoneration. As military secrets shape headlines and scapegoats resurface in new forms, the lesson endures. What would justice look like if we actually learned from the depths? Share your thoughts below.